Hello, in today's video we're going to look at how to carry out a job interview in a little bit of detail. So going to look into a little bit of detail about kind of things you should be thinking about before the interview, how to prepare for the interview, and what should actually happen during the interview itself. So as I say, I'm going to look at some of the key considerations, what's involved in the planning of the interview, how to conduct the interview itself, and then what actually happens after the interview as well. So I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail, but when you're thinking about setting up an interview, you have to decide, do you want an interview that's going to be really informal and just one person interviewing, or are you going to have a panel? The advantage of a panel, although sometimes it can be quite daunting for the person being interviewed, the candidate, if you have a panel interview, then it means that it's less likely to be biased. So if one person is doing the interview, they may be influenced by their feelings about how they react to the candidate. So if you have a panel interview, that can take away some of that. So it makes it a more reliable selection method. You also have to think about whether you're actually going to have a face-to-face interview in a meeting room, or you're going to do something by telephone. Might be useful if you're going to be interviewing someone that has to do a lot of work by telephone, perhaps in a call centre or working as a receptionist. You might want them to do a telephone interview just to see what their telephone manner's like. But given the current situation with COVID, obviously face-to-face interviews are much more problematic and more difficult. So more and more companies are looking at doing video interviews using Zoom, using Teams. So the idea of actually conducting an interview by video conferencing is something that's happening as well. So you have to decide what your what the interview is actually going to, what the format is, where it's going to take place. You should also think about who are actually going to be involved in the panel, and then once you've got your panel selected, think about who's actually going to chair the meeting. But in terms of your panel members, do you want the line manager, who the person that you're going to be interviewing will ultimately be reporting to? Do you want the head of another department? Do you want someone that's going to be working alongside the person who's being interviewed? Do you want someone from HR there just to help, give some guidance, give some support if you're not entirely sure what you're doing or what should happen? Having HR there can sometimes be quite reassuring. You also want to think about where you're going to have the meeting, the interview take place. Make sure that you're giving enough time, so that you're actually allowing enough time for questions to be asked, for the candidate to respond. You don't want them feeling that the interview is being rushed, because sometimes that can give an impression that you don't really want to listen to them, that they're not valued, and therefore that gives a bad impression of the organisation. So make sure you've given enough time. If you are doing it by telephone or video conferencing, make sure that you've got the technology set aside, that everything's going to work perfectly when you have your interview. Equally, if you're if the meeting's taking place in a meeting room, you want to make sure that it's somewhere neutral, that if the manager has the interview in their office, then sometimes that can be distracting because it can be cluttered, it can be busy, there could be interruptions. So sometimes booking a meeting room and having the interview take place out of the normal working environment means that there's less likelihood of distractions, of interruptions, things like that as well. So you think about also, do you want a formal panel interview where the panel sits behind the table and the candidate sits in front of them and they feel as if they're being examined or grilled? If you have a round table or someone sitting at the corner, so it's less formal, and perhaps also from the candidate's point of view less intimidating. So think about how the room itself is laid up when you're designing the interview as well. So once we've looked at the basic ideas of who's doing the interview, what type of interview you're going to have, you have to think about the actual interview itself. So as I said previously, you have to think about deciding who's actually going to be the chair, who's going to be the person that's controlling the interview, the meeting, and what they should do once you've got your panel organised, obviously working in conjunction with HR. If you have an HR department, you would think about the kind of questions that you want to ask, and you would have your questions planned out and written prior to the interview. You want to make sure that all the candidates are being asked the same questions, and your questions should be built around what's in your person specification or your job description. So if you have a list of essential criteria, you want to be asking questions about those essential criteria, and all candidates should be meeting the essential criteria, so you should be able to ask every candidate the same questions. So you have your interview plan, which will contain the questions themselves. You will have an interview plan that sort of details exactly what's happening, who's asking what questions, who's opening the interview, who's closing the interview, and you will decide what running order things are going to go in, so what order you ask the questions. But just so that the interview moves smoothly, you want to make sure that the panel members know who's asking which questions, so they don't get confused and end up with everybody trying to ask the same questions. So it's better to almost have it scripted, so that panel member 1 asks questions 1 and 2, the chair asks question 3. So you've got all of that will be flowing through and should be clearly identified in the interview plan. I've already talked about making sure there's sufficient time for the interview and the setting up of the room. So again, just making sure that all of that's organised. And prior to the interview itself, the panel should be reading through the applicant's CV or application form, however they've applied for the job. You should be looking through their information. As I said, you will have a set of questions that are going to be standard, that you will ask all the candidates the same questions, but you will also want to ask questions that are specific about information they've put into their application. So if there's something in their application when you read through it that really jumps out at you, then you might want to ask questions about that. Or equally, during the interview, the candidate may offer some information that you think is interesting or relevant, and you want to dig a little bit deeper again. So, there are opportunities where you can ask additional questions beyond what you have written into your interview plan. So you've got to think about these things. So reading the CV or the application form before the interview allows you to plan ahead and get a feel for the candidate before you meet them as well. So thinking about the interview itself, we can put the interview into 3 different stages. So you have the beginning, where you bring the candidate in, you get them settled, you help to calm their nerves a little bit before you move on to the main part of the interview, the middle, which will be the questions. And then the end, as the name suggests, you're really just bringing everything together, thanking the candidate for coming and letting them know what's going to happen next. So now going to go through step by step what happens in each part of the interview itself. So I think it's useful to think about the interview starting from the point where you actually go to collect the candidate from reception or wherever it is that they happen to be sitting waiting for you. They're going to have formed an impression of the organisation from how they're greeted at reception, how you interact with them once you come to collect them. Do you introduce yourself? Do you talk to them as you're taking them along to the interview, or do they just trot along behind you in total silence? So obviously engaging in small talk as you take them to the interview room, particularly if it's maybe quite a long walk, can be reassuring, and it helps the candidate to feel at ease a little bit, and it helps to calm the nerves. So once you get into the meeting room, obviously, if you've collected them from reception, I would like to think that you've already introduced yourself. So now would be your turn to introduce the rest of the panel and introduce the panel to the candidate as well. Ask them to take a seat, perhaps telling them where you want them to sit if there's a choice of chairs. Maybe at this point you might offer them some refreshments. But you're really just trying to help relax things a little bit. The candidate's going to be nervous, so you want to help them relax so that they're going to be able to give you the best information that they can at the interview. So you would then move on to outlining what's actually going to happen during the interview. So you might tell them, going to ask you some questions. We'll be taking notes and explain why you're taking notes, why that's important. Sometimes the candidate might also want to take notes, so tell them that if they want to take notes, that's okay. And then once you've outlined what's going to happen during the interview, also tell them that, once you've finished asking your questions, you'll give them the opportunity to ask any questions that they might have. But once you've outlined what's actually going to happen during the interview, you may then want to think about asking some opening questions, and you might want to do so. You don't want this to be so wide that they give you their life history, but you want to ask them something that they're familiar with, that they're comfortable with, so that they'll start to relax as they're talking. If you've looked at their application form and they've talked about an interesting hobby, you might want to ask them about their hobby, about, if they say they've spent time working in Japan, for example, you might want to ask them about that experience. But really the idea is just to help them relax so that they're going to settle down and their nerves are not going to be as much of a problem. So once you've gone through your initial opening stage, you want to get into the meaty part of the interview. You want to start asking your actual job-specific questions. So you're going to ask questions about the job itself, what skills they're bringing, what experience they have that will be beneficial to the job that they're being interviewed for. As I said already, you're going to have a set of questions that you should be asking everybody, so everybody's being scored on the same questions. So you're ensuring consistency, you're ensuring fairness. Note taking is really important because a candidate, whether they're successful or not, can request to see their notes from an interview, and the notes have to be able to stand up against accusations of discrimination, for example. So you have to make sure that the process is transparent, that it's being consistent, you're treating everybody the same way. You want to ask open questions so that your candidate's going to give you lots of information. You want them to tell you about their experiences, so ask them experiential questions such as give me an example of a time when you used excellent customer service skills, or give me an example of a time when you've gone above and beyond to meet the needs of a customer, just for example. So you're getting them to tell you about their actual experiences of what they've actually done in the past. But sometimes we also need to ask closed questions. Sometimes it can be just to confirm that you've understood something. So you're telling me that you really enjoyed doing that kind of work. And they're going to say yes or no to that. So you're just checking your understanding. Equally, it can be, can I double check that we have the correct telephone number for you? So closed questions have a purpose, but majority of the time when you're putting the questions into your interview plan and you want to ask questions that are related to their work experience, their history, their strengths and weaknesses, those sorts of things, you really do want to ask open questions. You also want to ask probing questions that are going to draw out additional information, particularly if you have a candidate that's very nervous it might take a little bit of encouragement, and that's where probing questions would come in. So you're trying to draw out more information, you're trying to draw out additional details from them by digging that little bit deeper, trying to get them to talk to you a little bit more. As I said, the questions should relate directly to the job, to the essential criteria that are going to be in the role profile or the job person specification. And you want to make sure that you avoid leading questions. So that's where you're going to ask a question where the candidate has been led up the garden path, so to speak, and the way you phrase a question indicates the answer that you're going to expect. If you've got someone at a job interview and you ask them about their timekeeping, they're not going to tell you their timekeeping's poor because they want the job. So, be careful of the kind of how you word your questions as well. But also watch out for multiple questions. That's where you're asking more than one question at the same time. It can get confusing. The candidate, particularly if they're nervous, might not know which question to answer, or they answer one question and forget what else you've asked. So it's better to break down your questions so that you've got, if you want to ask 2 or 3 questions under the one topic, make it A, B, and C, so that you ask the questions separately and get the answers to all your questions. So once you've gone through all of your questions, you want to bring everything together and finish off the interview so that it leaves a candidate with a nice feeling about the organisation, about how they've been treated, and the professionalism of how the interview has been conducted. There's nothing worse than you interview a candidate, you think they're the perfect person for the organisation, but they've actually left the interview with a bad impression of the company and don't want to work for you. So you want to make sure that you finish off the interview with a professional manner. So once you've finished your questions, tell them that you've finished your questions and ask them if they have any questions. Obviously, taking a note of whatever it is they ask. Go over the terms and conditions. Discuss pay if that's appropriate at that point. Sometimes it can be a discussion round about do they have any holidays booked and things like that as well. Then you would also make sure, if they haven't already asked it as part of their questions, that you tell them how they're going to be notified of the outcome and when they're likely to hear. Thank them for coming to the interview, and then just as you collect them from reception, you should show them back out of the interview meeting room, back to reception or to the front door, whatever. But make them feel that you're not just trying to get rid of them. I think that's really important. So that's the interview itself. Remember, there are the 3 different stages: the beginning, the middle, and the end. So the middle is the main questions, but how it's all packaged as an entire experience for the candidate and for the panel conducting the interview as well is really important. So after the interview, the candidate goes away and they wait to hear from you, but you've obviously got to make a decision about who to give the job to. So you're going to go through your notes that you took during the interview. You're going to be reviewing how they responded to your questions, what information did they give you, did they go into enough detail with regards to whatever it was you're looking for. And most interview plans that have the questions would also have a scoring mechanism to attach scores to the answers that the candidate's given. So the panel will work together to score the interview results, and then basically the person that gets the highest score would be offered the job. You contact the successful candidate to offer them the job. Usually nowadays that would be done by telephone or sometimes text message or something like that. There's so many different ways of communicating very quickly these days. But you would contact the successful candidate, wait and see if they're going to take the job, before you contact the unsuccessful candidates. So once you know the candidate's taking the job, you can then contact the unsuccessful candidates and let them know that, unfortunately this time they've not been successful, but you want to leave them with a good impression of the company so that if another vacancy arises, they're going to apply again. So once you've decided who you're going to offer the job to, you've contacted them and said that you're interested in offering the job, usually that would be subject to satisfactory references, any pre-employment checks, things like that. So depending on the kind of job, they may require residency checks, they may require criminal records checks, those sorts of things. Some jobs may also require a medical. So the offer of the job is going to be subject to all of these checks, which would have to be carried out. And then obviously once all of that's been completed satisfactorily, you would then look at organising the induction and getting the employee started with their employment. So I hope that has all been very interesting. But if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.